The Bible is a living and effective book, Hebrews chapter 4 and in verse 12 tells us. And one of the powerful things about the Bible is the true stories that's contained in it. These stories are not just helpful for us understanding the overall Bible story, the message of the Bible that's revealed, but it also teaches us many valuable lessons that are applicable to us today, Romans chapter 15 and verse 4. One such story that we read about in the Bible is a story about how an Israelite named Aiken sinned and the consequences of his sin revealed in Joshua chapter 7. So the purpose of this lesson is to learn how Achan sinned regarding the things devoted by God and lessons that are applicable to us today. But let's spend a few moments getting the context behind this story. First, we notice that Israel defeated Jericho. Joshua chapter 6 records the great victory that God delivered his people Israel to over the city of Jericho by starting this task of conquering the Canaan land west of the Jordan River. When Israel did what God had instructed, God caused the walls around the city of Jericho to fall, and they collapsed, or they advanced into the city and then destroyed the city. But the Israelites had been told not to take anything from the city for themselves. In a general sense, the Israelites had been warned not to covet the gold or silver of the idols in the land, so they would not be ensnared to worship those false gods. In Deuteronomy 7, verses 24 through 26, preparing the people to the point where they would go in, he says, "He will hand their kings over to you, and you will wipe out their names under heaven. No one will be able to stand against you. You will annihilate them. Burn up the carved images of their gods. Don't covet the silver and gold on the images and take it for yourself, or you will be ensnared by it. For it is detestable to the Lord your God. Do not bring any detestable thing into your house, or you will be set apart for destruction like it. You are to abhor and detest it utterly, because it is set apart for destruction." Specifically concerning the city of Jericho, all the troops were under strict instructions not to take of any of the city's plunder in Joshua 6 verses 17 and 18. The instructions were very clear. But the city and everything in it are set apart to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and everyone with her in the house will live, because she hid the messengers we sent. But keep yourselves from the things set apart, or you will be set apart for destruction. If you take any of those things, you will set apart the camp of Israel for destruction and make trouble for it. So God had been very clear, and if they did not obey these particular instructions, the camp of Israel would be set apart for destruction and they would make trouble for it. Overall, the Israelites obeyed God's instructions, and the city of Jericho was destroyed, and everything and everyone in it, as Joshua chapter 6 verse 21 and verse 24 shows us. They completely destroyed everything in the city. It tells us in verse 21. Verse 24, they burned the city and everything in it, and put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. That's what God had told them to do, because some things were devoted to God. So among the things of the city of Jericho were some things that were to be taken into the Lord's treasury, all of the silver and gold and bronze and iron, as God had given them instructions as recorded in Joshua 6 and verse 19. And again, overall, this command was followed by the Israelite troops when they were destroying the city of Jericho. Again, Joshua 6 and verse 24. And it's interesting, if you had stopped with the conclusion of Joshua chapter 6, you would conclude that the Israelites had been faithful to God in conquering Jericho, and they were now well on their way to conquering the Canaan land overall. But there's more to the story, and that's where we get into the lesson today, specifically in Joshua chapter 7. So let's think about the story that's told here in Joshua, the 7th chapter. Let's think about how there was sin in Israel, chapter 7 and verse 1. The Israelites, however, were unfaithful regarding the things set apart for destruction. Aiken, son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, took some of what was set apart, and the Lord's anger burned against the Israelites. So even though the instructions were very clear and the consequences were very clear concerning the plunder of the city of Jericho, that they were destroy all those things except for the things that were set apart to be taken into the Lord's treasury, but not all the Israelites obeyed. Israel's unfaithfulness to God was made evident here in this particular verse as one man by the name of Aiken from the tribe of Judah had taken of these things that God said don't take from. Next, we look in verses 2 through 5 of chapter 7, and we see the defeat that the Israelites experienced at the hand of Ai. It says, Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is near Bethaven, east of Bethel, and told them, go up and scout the land. So the men went up and scouted Ai. After returning to Joshua, they reported to him, don't send all the people, but send about 2,000 or 3,000 men to attack Ai. Since the people of Ai are so few, don't wear out all of our people there. So about 3,000 men went up there, but they fled from the men of Ai. The men of Ai struck down about 36 of them and chased them from outside the city gate to the quarries, striking them down on the descent. As a result, the people lost heart. So coming off their victory of Jericho, here's Joshua planning for the next battle against Ai and sending men to scout the land. Evidently, this was Joshua's own decision, as God did not tell Joshua that the land had been handed over to him, as we'll see in chapter 8 and verse 1. And when they returned, they reported that the Israelites, they didn't need to send all of their men into battle. Ai was a small place in population, 12,000 people in total, according to chapter 8 and verse 25. So it was determined to just send about 3,000 men then, that would be sufficient, so the rest of the warriors would not become worn out. To the surprise of Israel, of course, they suffered defeat at Ai, including the loss of about 36 soldiers. And this caused great discouragement in Israel regarding the capturing of the Canaan land. And you can just imagine the discouragement that you would feel in their situation. Next, we notice that Joshua grieves and he seeks answers in verses 6 through 9. It says, then Joshua tore his clothes and fell face down to the ground before the ark of the Lord until evening, as did the elders of Israel. They all put dust on their heads. O Lord God, Joshua said, why did you ever bring these people across the Jordan to hand us over to the Amorites for our destruction? If only we had been content to remain on the other side of the Jordan. What can I say, Lord, now that Israel has turned its back and run from its enemies? When the Canaanites and all who live in the land hear about this, they will surround us and wipe out our name from the earth. Then what will you do about your great name? Joshua was discouraged and Joshua was confused about why this had happened. He and all the elders of Israel wept before the Lord. And Joshua inquired why God had ever chosen to bring the Israelites across the Jordan if this is how it was going to end. If this were the case, they should have just stayed on the other side of the Jordan. And Joshua feared the rest of the Canaanites would hear about this, and they would be emboldened then to attack Israel, hearing what had happened to them at Ai, and they would be emboldened to wipe them off the earth. And Joshua questioned God, what God would do then for his great name if his people could be wiped off the earth by other nations. Next, we look at verses 10 through 15. We see Jehovah answers. Then the Lord then said to Joshua, stand up. Why have you fallen face down? Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant that I appointed for them. They have taken some of what was set apart. They have stolen, deceived, and put those things with their own belongings. This is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies. They will turn their backs and run from their enemies because they have been set apart for destruction. I will no longer be with you unless you remove from among you what is set apart. As Jehovah answered Joshua, he indicated Joshua shouldn't be lying there in helpless grief. Instead, he should have realized that Israel had sinned and that God was being fair in doing what had just been done, just as God indicated would happen in Joshua chapter 6 and verse 18. God identified that Israel had lied, stolen, and put among their own possessions those things that had been devoted. And then Joshua was instructed on how they were to identify the culprit as we keep reading. Go and consecrate the people. Tell them to consecrate themselves for tomorrow, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There are things that are set apart among you, Israel. You will not be able to stand against your enemies until you remove what is set apart. In the morning, present yourselves tribe by tribe. The tribe the Lord selects is to come forward clan by clan. The clan the Lord selects is to come forward family by family. The family the Lord selects is to come forward man by man. The one who is caught with the things set apart must be burned, along with everything he has, because he has violated the Lord's covenant and committed an outrage in Israel. So this is what God says has to happen. This is how you identify who it was, the culprit of the sin, and here's what you're to do with this one, to be burned and everything that he has. We keep going in verses 16 through 18, and we see that Aiken is the one who is identified. Joshua got up early the next morning. He had Israel come forward tribe by tribe, and the tribe of Judah was selected. He had the clans of Judah come forward, and the Zerathite clan was selected. He had the Zerathite clan come forward by heads of families, and Zabdi was selected. Then he had Zabdi's family come forward man by man, and Aiken, son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, of the tribe of Judah, was selected. So as Joshua followed Jehovah's instructions to identify the offender, and each tribe came before him, probably a representative from each tribe, the tribe of Judah was selected, and then the various clans of Judah came forward and onward until it was whittled down until you get to Aiken. And the next passages we see Aiken's confession in verses 19 through 23. Joshua said to Aiken, "My son, give glory to the Lord, the God of Israel, and make a confession to him. I urge you, tell me what you have done. Don't hide anything from me." Aiken replied to Joshua, "It is true. I have sinned against the Lord, the God of Israel. This is what I did. When I saw among the spoils a beautiful cloak from Babylon, 5 pounds of silver, and a bar of gold weighing 1.25 pounds, I coveted them and took them. You can see for yourself. They are concealed in the ground inside my tent, with the silver under the cloak." So Joshua sent messengers who ran to the tent, and there was the cloak, concealed in his tent, with the silver underneath. They took the things from inside the tent, brought them to Joshua and all the Israelites, and spread them out in the Lord's presence. Joshua encouraged Achan to give glory to God and confess what he had done, not hiding any of the details. So Achan confessed his sin against God that was due to his covetousness whenever he saw the spoils of Jericho, most notably a beautiful Babylonian cloak, silver, and gold. And therefore he took both from what was devoted to destruction and what was devoted to God. He had hidden these things in the ground under his tent, and those sent to investigate the matter found the spoil where Aiken had said and brought it back to Joshua. Next, as we keep going in verses 24 through 26, we see Achan's punishment at the end of this chapter. It says, Then Joshua and all Israel with him took Aiken, son of Zerah, the silver, the cloak, and the bar of gold, his sons and daughters, his ox, donkey, and sheep, his tent, and all that he had, and brought them up to the Valley of Acor. Joshua said, Why have you brought us trouble? Today the Lord will bring you trouble. So all Israel stoned them to death. They burned their bodies, threw their stones on them, and raised over him a large pile of rocks that remains still today. Then the Lord turned from his burning anger. Therefore that place is called the Valley of Acor still today. Joshua and Israel took Aiken, along with his family, the spoil, and all that he had to the Valley of Acor, which means trouble. And Joshua declared that just as Aiken had brought trouble on Israel, they would bring trouble on him. And they were all stoned to death and burned, and a large pile of stones was raised over them. And then the Lord turned from his anger against the Israelites. But next, as the story continues then into chapter 8, and you can read chapter 8, verses 1 through 29. We won't, for the sake of time in this particular lesson. But if you look through that text, then what we find is there's a victory that Israel experiences at Ai. In verses 1 and 2 of Joshua chapter 8, it says, Then the Lord said to Joshua, Do not be afraid or discouraged. Take all the troops with you and go attack Ai. Look, I have handed over to you the king of Ai, his people, city, and land. Treat Ai and its king as you did Jericho and its king, except that you may plunder its spoil and livestock for yourselves. Set an ambush behind the city. So Jehovah told Joshua not to be afraid of going or discouraged to go and attack the city of Ai, that God had delivered the city to them. Furthermore, God now allowed the people to plunder the city of Ai and take of its spoil for themselves. The strategy that would be employed as you keep going, and even as this passage shows us, was an ambush, using about 30,000 of the best soldiers. Joshua and those who were with him would draw out all the fighting men of the city of Ai, retreating before them, so they would think they were retreating as before in defeat. And then the remainder of the people would come from behind and set fire to Ai, and then surround the army on both sides. And this strategy was executed, and Ai was completely defeated, according to chapter 8, verses 24 through 27. It says, When Israel had finished killing everyone living in Ai who had pursued them into the open country, and when every last one of them had fallen by the sword, all Israel returned to Ai and struck it down with the sword. The total of those who fell that day, both men and women, was 12,000, all the people of Ai. Joshua did not draw back his hand that was holding the javelin until all the inhabitants of Ai were completely destroyed. Israel plundered only the cattle and spoil of that city for themselves, according to the Lord's command that he had given Joshua. And then, to finish the story, we see then throughout the remainder of chapter 8 that the law of God is read. So after the victory at Ai, Joshua built an altar to God on Mount Ebal and copied the law of Moses onto these stones. In chapter 8, verses 34 and 35, it says, Afterward Joshua read aloud all the words of the law, the blessings as well as the curses, according to all that is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua did not read before the entire assembly of Israel, including the women, the dependents, and the resident aliens who lived among them. So all Israel stood around the Ark of the Covenant, and Joshua read the words from the law of Moses aloud, including the blessings and the cursings. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua did not read before all the assembly, including the women, the children, the resident aliens living among them. Now, although God was beginning to give them this promised land, this does not guarantee that they would possess it all or continue to live in it. Rather, they had to be reminded of the blessings of obeying God's law and the curses they would face if they disobeyed. So that's the story. And now let's move into what are the application lessons that we can take from this story concerning Aiken. Well, there are several, but let's just consider a few. Number one, God gives clear instructions. The instructions the Israelites were told to follow were not confusing. Again, in chapter 6, verses 17 through 19. They were to destroy everything in the city of Jericho except for those things that God had identified that were then to be taken into the Lord's treasury, or they would be destroyed. And they would bring trouble for Israel. And so both the instructions and the consequences were very clear. In fact, whenever Aiken was confronted about these things, he never even tried to say that he did not understand. God gives us clear instructions in the pages of his word today concerning how we're to live. And as people who are fighting in a spiritual war, we must be careful as to how we live here in this earthly land. And both its blessings and its consequences can be clearly understood and are identified very clearly in the Scriptures. Next, we learn that great victories do not exempt us from temptation. Just think about it. Aiken had just witnessed God's wonderful power and judgment against Jericho, this wicked city. He was witnessing God keep his promises to bring his people into the Canaan land. And he should have had great hope of possessing the Canaan land. Still, he gave in to the temptation and sinned against God. We should never let our guards down against temptation, even when we're doing things that God is pleased with. For when it's often when we think that we're safe, we think we're strong, we're confident in ourselves, that Satan has a way of manipulating the situation so that we fall. 1 Corinthians 10 verse 12 says, "So whoever thinks he stands must be careful not to fall." It's easy to feel as though we are invincible after experiencing some kind of victory. But we must watch out in these moments, just like Aiken, as temptation may be right around the corner. Another lesson that we learn is that God cannot remain with sinners. Sometimes maybe we look at Achan's sin and say, well, what's the big deal? Why did God need to be that harsh? Why those consequences, right? Those kinds of things. But Achan's sin was a big deal. We must always remember that sin is a big deal because God is holy. And because he is separate from everything evil, he could no longer be with the Israelites until that sin was corrected. Joshua 7 and in verse 12. God says, "I will no longer be with you unless you remove from among you what is set apart." Anytime at this time, God had given the only solution to this problem of sin in this particular circumstance as the death of the violator, right? Because sin always requires life as a payment for sin. Sometimes we may try to justify our sin and try to say that it's really no big deal. However, we must be assured that sin is always a serious and big deal, because sin is always contrary to God's holy nature. Thankfully, of course, Jesus has provided his life as the payment for sin that we needed through his sacrifice on the cross that will appease the wrath of God. Romans chapter 5, verses 8 through 10 tells us. Next, we can learn the lesson that God knows even when no one else does. It appears that no one else knew about Aiken and what he had done. Aiken had tried to carefully conceal the things that he had stolen, even hiding the spoil in the ground, chapter 7, verses 21 through 23. But God knew exactly what had been done, and he knew exactly who had done it. Right? We're introduced to that in verse 1. And God names him about why these things were then starting to take place. When he tells Joshua, Israel has sinned. And then he knew what had been done, had stolen, deceived, and put those things in their own belongings. Verses 16 through 18, as God walks Israel through the process of identifying the person, God knew all along. Sometimes maybe we think we're getting away with whatever the evil thing is that we're trying to do. We think nobody else knows anything about it. But God always knows what is done, even those things that are done in secret. Read Proverbs 15 and verse 3, Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 14. Hebrews 4 and verse 13 says, no creature is hidden from him, but all things are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give an account. Next, we can learn that covetousness is idolatry. As Achan was confessing his sin to Joshua, he said that he was motivated to take of these things that had been devoted because of his own covetousness. Look in verse 21 of chapter 7. He says, I coveted them and took them. Maybe he hadn't intended to take of all these things the whole time, but maybe when he saw them, right, and had this great desire for what he saw, he chose to fulfill his own desires rather than obey God, making covetousness then his God. Well, whether for possessions or for pleasures, our own greed, our own covetousness works against us, choosing to honor Jehovah God in our lives, and often leads us in ways that violate God's commandments. And therefore, covetousness for these earthly things is a form of idolatry. Colossians 3 and verse 5 talks about greed or covetousness, which is idolatry. Because we honor those desires above Jehovah. Next, we need to learn the lesson that sin always has consequences. Perhaps Achan thought he had escaped the consequences for his sin after he had finally gotten all of these things hidden inside of his tent. But yet God kept his word, as he always does, and brought consequences on the Israelites and Achan just as he had promised in chapter 6 and in verse 18. Certainly his sin had been found out, and he would surely pay the price for it. The reality is that even when we think we've gotten away with our sin, we've seen that God always knows, and we must not be deceived to think that our sin will go unpunished. Although it's often true that sin has physical consequences attached to it, like guilt and broken relationships and regret and various earthly consequences, the consequences are often physically not as severe as they were with Achan. Yet, there are always spiritual consequences for our sins, including a broken relationship with God, separation from the spiritual blessings that God provides, and, unless we repent, eternal punishment in the fires of hell. Another lesson that we can learn is that our decisions impact others. Although Achan was held personally responsible for his sin and suffered the consequences, others were harmed physically by his actions, though they were not spiritually accountable for Achan's sin. Think about who else suffered because of Achan's decisions. The 36 soldiers who died, you could also think about their families. Israel as a nation was discouraged by what had happened in Ai, and Achan's family were killed. And although this may seem unfair as to why God would allow others to suffer because of one man's sin, we've got to remember that this is the reality of living in a fallen world. Sin is ugly and causes great suffering throughout this world in many ways, even to those who are innocent of it. Yet we must be assured that God only holds those responsible for sin spiritually for the sin he or she commits, and not for the sins of another, Ezekiel 18 and verse 20. So we've got to take this lesson and really soberly recognize that our sin does not just have the potential to impact ourselves in negative ways, but that others may also experience consequences because of our wicked decisions and actions, such as our family members. And the final lesson I want us to consider from the story today is that no victory should be expected if God is not with us. When the Israelites went into battle against Ai for the first time without God being with them, because there was sin in the camp, so to speak, they were defeated. It was only when God was with them the second time that they were then victorious. After the sin was corrected, chapter 8 and verse 1, again, the Lord told Joshua, "Do not be afraid or discouraged. Take all the troops with you and go attack Ai. Look, I have handed over to you the king of Ai, his people, city, and land." As we face many obstacles in our lives, we should not expect to be victorious unless God is with us and we are living for him. Although we may devise our own strategies about how we may be successful in various areas of life, we will ultimately be defeated if God is not with us. Well, as we close, Achans' sin came at a great cost to himself as well as to the nation of Israel. But Israel was able to correct the sin and move forward past the sin and to continue conquering the land as you continue to read through the book of Joshua. But we can learn some great lessons from this story that are relevant to living to please God today. So let's make sure that we never forget these lessons, and let's be making the proper applications of them.